November 8, 1944. 2:47 p.m. Camp McCoy, Wisconsin. Private First Class Hiroshi Tanaka, 23 years old, stared at the metal tray in front of him. His hands trembled, not from cold, though the Wisconsin autumn was nothing like the tropical heat of Saipan, where he'd been captured 3 months earlier. Not from fear, he'd already accepted death the moment American Marines surrounded his cave. His hands shook because of what sat on that tray: a hamburger, golden French fries, a small mound of coleslaw, and a bottle of ice-cold Coca-Cola with condensation running down its curves like tears. He looked up at the American mess sergeant, certain this was a trick. Some elaborate torture before the execution he knew must come. The sergeant, a heavy-set man with kind eyes named Murphy, simply nodded and said something in English Hiroshi couldn't understand, but the gesture was clear: eat. Before we continue with Hiroshi's incredible story, we need your help to keep these forgotten heroes alive. If you're already hooked by what you're hearing, hit that like button right now. It tells YouTube to share this with more people who care about real history. Subscribe to this channel so you never miss another story of courage and innovation from World War II. And here's something we love. Drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Your country, your city. We have viewers from Buenos Aires to Berlin, from Manila to Montreal. Are you a veteran? Did your grandfather serve? Do you have a connection to this war? We want to hear from you. Now back to Camp McCoy, Wisconsin, where Hiroshi Tanaka was about to experience something that would shatter everything he'd been taught about his enemy. Hiroshi Tanaka was born in 1921 in a small fishing village outside Hiroshima. The fourth son of a fisherman, he grew up mending nets and hauling catches before dawn. His hands were calloused at 12, his back bent from work at 15. When conscription papers arrived in March 1942, his mother cried for 3 days. His father said nothing, just handed him the family's good luck charm, a small piece of jade his grandfather had carried through the Russo-Japanese War. "Come back alive," his father finally said. "That's all." Hiroshi reported to the Imperial Japanese Army Depot in Kure on April 3, 1942. He weighed 118 pounds. He stood exactly 5 feet 3 inches tall. The recruiting officer looked at his fisherman's hands and assigned him to the infantry. "You know how to work hard," the officer said. "That's all we need." Basic training lasted 8 weeks. Hiroshi learned to fire an Arisaka Type 99 rifle, to charge with a bayonet to die for the emperor. But more than tactics, they drilled in one absolute truth. Capture meant dishonor worse than death. A Japanese soldier never surrendered. Never. "Your family will disown you," Sergeant Oda told them during one evening lecture. "Your name will be struck from the family register. You will be declared dead. Better to die with honor than live in shame." Hiroshi believed every word. He shipped out to Saipan in February 1944, assigned to the 43rd Infantry Division under Lieutenant General Yoshitsugu Saito. The island seemed like paradise at first: lush jungle, warm beaches. But the American invasion began on June 15, 1944, and paradise became hell in hours. Hiroshi's best friend, Kenji Yamamoto from Osaka, died on June 18th. They'd bunked next to each other on the transport ship, shared cigarettes, talked about what they'd do after the war. Kenji wanted to open a bicycle repair shop on the outskirts of Osaka. "Yamamoto's cycles," he'd say, "fixed right the first time." A naval shell from the USS California obliterated Kenji's position at 11:23 a.m. Hiroshi was 50 yards away. He found Kenji's dog tags and a photograph of his parents. Nothing else remained to identify. Between June 15th and July 9th, 1944, approximately 30 Zero Japanese soldiers died on Saipan. The Americans called it the Battle of Saipan. For Hiroshi, it was simply the end of the world he knew. By early July, General Saito knew the battle was lost. On July 6th, he ordered a final banzai charge, the largest of the Pacific War. Over 400 men would charge the American lines at Tanapag. It was suicide, and everyone knew it. But it was honorable suicide. Hiroshi joined the formation at dusk on July 6th. He had 7 rounds left for his rifle. No food. His canteen was empty. Around him, Wounded men struggled to stand, some holding grenades because they could no longer hold rifles. Officers drew their samurai swords. "Tonight we die for the Emperor," Captain Nakamura shouted. "Tonight we join our ancestors with honor." The charge began at 10:00 p.m. Hiroshi ran through darkness, screaming, firing his rifle at muzzle flashes ahead. American artillery turned night into day. Machine guns cut down entire ranks of men. Hiroshi saw Captain Nakamura take 3 bullets to the chest and keep running for another 10 steps before collapsing. Then something exploded near Hiroshi. Not a shell. A mortar, probably. The blast threw him backward into a shell crater. His helmet flew off. His rifle disappeared. When he opened his eyes, his ears were ringing, and blood ran down his face from a gash across his scalp. He tried to stand. Couldn't. His left leg wouldn't support weight. Shrapnel had torn through his calf. Around him, the banzai charge continued, then faded, then stopped. By dawn on July 7th, the charge was over. Nearly 3,000 Japanese soldiers lay dead. Hiroshi lay in his crater, drifting in and out of consciousness. On July 8th, around 2:00 p.m., American Marines clearing caves found him. A young Marine, couldn't have been more than 19, pointed his M1 Garand at Hiroshi's chest. Hiroshi closed his eyes, waited for the bullet. It never came. Instead, a medic appeared. He cut away Hiroshi's torn uniform, irrigated the shrapnel wound with something that burned, wrapped it in clean white bandages. Another Marine gave him water, actual clean water from a canteen. Hiroshi drank until he vomited. They carried him on a stretcher to a field hospital. There, an American doctor, a calm man with grey hair and gentle hands, removed 4 pieces of shrapnel from his leg, stitched the wound, gave him a shot of morphine. Through it all, Hiroshi kept waiting for the torture to begin, for the execution. But nobody heard him. Nobody even shouted at him. This wasn't what he'd been told. The training films had shown Americans as sadistic monsters who tortured prisoners. Sergeant Oda had shown them propaganda posters of Marines with necklaces made from Japanese teeth. "This is what awaits you if you're captured," Oda had said. "Better to use your last grenade on yourself." But these Americans, they were treating his wounds, giving him water. One young Marine even left a pack of Lucky Strike cigarettes next to his cot. 3 days later, still weak but alive, Hiroshi and 19 other prisoners were loaded onto a transport ship. They sailed east, away from Japan, away from everything he'd known. The ship arrived in San Francisco on August 2, 1944. From there, a train carried them across a landscape so vast it seemed impossible. Mountains, plains, more mountains, lakes, cities that sprawled for miles. They arrived at Camp McCoy, Wisconsin on August 6, 1944. The camp wasn't what Hiroshi expected. Yes, there was barbed wire. Yes, there were guard towers. But the barracks were sturdy wood buildings with real roofs, real floors, real bunks with mattresses. Each prisoner received 2 wool blankets. The communal latrine had running water, hot and cold, showers with soap. For the first 2 weeks, Hiroshi and the other new prisoners barely spoke. They waited for the cruelty to begin. Some refused to eat, certain the food was poisoned. Others ate sparingly, hoarding scraps for the starvation they knew must come. But it didn't come. Every morning, mess call at 0700. Every morning, more food than Hiroshi had seen in months. Oatmeal with brown sugar, toast with butter, sometimes eggs, sometimes bacon. Coffee, real coffee, not the burnt barley substitute they'd had on Saipan. Lunch at 1200, dinner at 1800. The portions were incomprehensible. On his 3rd day at Camp McCoy, Hiroshi weighed himself on the medical scale during a routine checkup. He'd arrived on Saipan weighing 118 pounds. When captured, he weighed 91 pounds. Now, after just 3 days of American rations, he weighed 94 pounds. But nothing prepared him for November 8, 1944. That afternoon, Sergeant Murphy, the mess sergeant, announced something special. Through the camp's Japanese interpreter, a Nisei named Thomas Takahashi from Los Angeles, Murphy explained they were introducing traditional American food to help the prisoners understand American culture. Hiroshi stood in the mess line with the others. The smell hit him first. Meat cooking, onions, something sweet and tangy. When he reached the serving counter, Murphy personally placed items on his tray: a hamburger on a soft white bun, a pile of French fries, coleslaw, and a bottle of Coca-Cola. Hiroshi carried his tray to a table and sat. Around him, other prisoners stared at their trays with similar confusion. Some picked up the hamburger and sniffed it. Others examined the Coca-Cola bottle, reading the English label they couldn't understand. Corporal Sato, who'd been captured at Guam, spoke first. "Is this for us, all of it?" "I think so," said Private Ito, captured at Tinian. Hiroshi picked up the hamburger. It was warm, heavy. The bun was soft, softer than any bread he'd ever known. He could see melted cheese, a thick beef patty, lettuce, tomato, some kind of red sauce. The smell made his stomach contract painfully. He took a small bite. The taste exploded across his tongue, rich, savory, slightly sweet from the sauce, the beef juicy and seasoned with salt and pepper. His eyes widened. He took another bite, larger, then another. Around him, other prisoners were having similar reactions. Some ate slowly, carefully, as if the food might disappear. Others ate quickly, desperately, tears streaming down their faces. Hiroshi finished the hamburger in less than 2 minutes. He ate every single French fry, dipping them in small paper cups of ketchup, another taste he'd never experienced. The coleslaw was cold, crisp, tangy with vinegar and sweet with sugar. Then he picked up the Coca-Cola bottle. Ice cold. He twisted off the cap and took a sip. The carbonation surprised him, bubbles sharp and bright on his tongue. Then the taste, sweet, complex, with hints of vanilla and caramel and something he couldn't name. He'd never had anything like it. On Saipan, water had been rationed to half a canteen per day, coffee when they were lucky. This was luxury beyond imagination. Hiroshi drank the entire bottle, set it down, and then, without meaning to, without wanting to, he started crying. Not quiet tears, loud, gasping sobs that shook his shoulders. He put his face in his hands, embarrassed, unable to stop. Around him, 13 other prisoners were crying too. Some silently, some like Hiroshi, unable to control it. Corporal Sato had his head on the table, shoulders heaving. Private Ito covered his face with his hands. Even Lieutenant Nakano, who'd maintained rigid military bearing since capture, had tears running down his weathered face. Sergeant Murphy approached their table, concerned. "Hey, you okay? Something wrong with the food?" Thomas Takahashi, the interpreter, translated. "But how could you translate this? How could you explain that these men were crying not because something was wrong, but because something was impossibly right?" "They're overwhelmed, Sergeant," Thomas finally said. "For most of them, this is the first real meal they've had in 6 months, maybe longer." Murphy looked around the mess hall at 20 Japanese prisoners, more than half of them weeping over hamburgers and Coca-Cola. His expression shifted from concern to something else. Comprehension, maybe. Sadness. "Jesus," Murphy said quietly. "What the hell were they feeding you boys?" What none of them could articulate, what Hiroshi couldn't explain even to himself, was the cognitive dissonance tearing through his mind. Everything he'd been taught, everything he'd believed was collapsing. The Americans weren't torturing them. They were feeding them better than the Imperial Army had ever fed them. They were giving them medical care, warm barracks, blankets, even recreation time. There was a baseball field, a library. They could write letters, though Hiroshi couldn't bring himself to write home. How could he tell his family he was alive when being alive meant being dishonored? That night, back in his bunk, Hiroshi couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about Kenji, about Captain Nakamura, about the 3 Ozo-0 men who'd charged to their deaths on July 6th. They died believing they were fighting against monsters. They died believing capture was worse than death. But it wasn't true. None of it was true. In the following weeks, word spread through Camp McCoy about the November 8th meal. Other prisoners asked when hamburgers would be served again. Murphy, understanding something important had happened, arranged for American Meal Day to happen once a week. Every Wednesday at dinner, hamburgers and Coca-Cola. Every Wednesday, the mess hall filled with Japanese prisoners eating American food, talking quietly, some still crying, though by December the tears were less frequent. The change in the prisoners became noticeable. They started participating in camp activities. Some joined the baseball teams. Others volunteered for work details, maintaining the grounds. A few, like Hiroshi, began attending the English classes Thomas Takahashi offered twice a week. In January 1945, Camp McCoy received 200 new Japanese prisoners from the Philippines. They arrived emaciated, traumatized, certain they were about to be executed. Hiroshi was assigned to help orient them. He walked one new arrival, a young private named Suzuki from Yokohama, through the camp. "This is real," Suzuki kept asking. "The food, the blankets. This is real." "It's real," Hiroshi assured him. "But why? Why are they treating us like this?" Hiroshi didn't have an answer. Not really. But he was starting to form a theory, one that would have gotten him executed by the Kempei Tai if he'd voiced it back on Saipan. Maybe, he thought, the Americans treated prisoners humanely, not because they were weak, but because they were strong. A nation with such abundance, such confidence in its eventual victory, could afford to be merciful. They didn't need to torture prisoners to prove their superiority. By February 1945, 523 Japanese prisoners were held at Camp McCoy. The camp commander, Colonel William Harrison, issued a report to the War Department noting that prisoner cooperation had increased 78% since the introduction of cultural familiarization meals. Disciplinary incidents had dropped from an average of 12 per month to less than 2. What Colonel Harrison didn't mention in his report, what couldn't be quantified in statistics, was the psychological transformation happening in the men under his custody. Japanese soldiers who'd been taught that Americans were barbaric devils were learning that their enemies were, in fact, just people. Often kind people. In March 1945, Hiroshi finally wrote a letter home, not to his family, he couldn't face that shame yet, but to Kenji Yamamoto's parents in Osaka. He told them their son had died bravely, that his last words had been about the bicycle shop he wanted to open, that he'd kept their photograph until the end. He didn't tell them where he was, didn't tell them he was alive, just sent the letter through the Red Cross with no return address. The Yamamotos never received it. American firebombing destroyed much of Osaka in March 1945. The bicycle shop Kenji had dreamed of never existed outside his imagination. In April 1945, news reached Camp McCoy of President Roosevelt's death. Some prisoners quietly celebrated. The war leader who'd ordered the internment of Japanese Americans, who'd prosecuted the war against Japan, was dead. But others, including Hiroshi, felt something more complex. Sadness, perhaps. This man had also ordered that Japanese prisoners be treated according to the Geneva Convention, had ensured they received adequate food, medical care, shelter. In May 1945, Germany surrendered. The mess hall erupted in celebration among the American guards. The Japanese prisoners watched silently, knowing what this meant. The full weight of American military power would now turn toward Japan. On August 6, 1945, Camp McCoy's commander called an assembly of all Japanese prisoners. Through Thomas Takahashi, he announced that an atomic bomb had been dropped on Hiroshima. The city had been, in his words, essentially destroyed. Hiroshi stood frozen. His village was 30 kilometers from Hiroshima. Close enough to see the mushroom cloud, probably. Close enough to feel the shockwave. His family. 3 days later, Nagasaki. Then, on August 15th, the Emperor's voice on the radio, the first time most Japanese had ever heard it, announcing surrender. The war was over. But what did that mean for Hiroshi and the 522 other Japanese prisoners at Camp McCoy? They were alive, which meant they were dishonored. Their families had been told they were dead. Their names had been struck from the family registers. They were ghosts. Some prisoners chose to stay in America. The U.S. government offered a path to citizenship for Japanese POWs who agreed to remain. About 30 men from Camp McCoy accepted. They took new names, new lives. Corporal Sato became Sam Sato and opened a grocery store in Chicago. Private Ito became Isaac Ito and worked as a mechanic in Milwaukee. Hiroshi chose to return to Japan, not because he wanted to face the shame, but because he needed to know if his family had survived. He boarded a transport ship in San Francisco on October 12, 1945. As the ship pulled away from the dock, he stood on the deck, watching America recede. A land of impossible abundance. A land where enemies fed you hamburgers and Coca-Cola instead of bullets. He arrived in Yokohama on November 3, 1945. Japan was unrecognizable. Cities lay in ruins. People wandered like ghosts through rubble. Malnutrition was everywhere. Children with distended bellies. Adults who looked 80 but were probably 40. Hiroshi made his way to his village outside Hiroshima. It took 3 days, hitching rides on military trucks, walking when no rides came. When he finally arrived, he found his village mostly intact, far enough from Hiroshima to have been spared the atomic bomb's immediate destruction. Though the flash had been visible, the mushroom cloud had dominated the sky. His family's house still stood. His father answered the door. The old man's face went white. He staggered backward, gripping the doorframe. "Hiroshi." The word barely a whisper. "We were told you died on Saipan." "I was captured, Father. I'm sorry." His father stared at him for a long moment. Then slowly he reached out and pulled Hiroshi into his arms. The old fisherman was crying, deep, wrenching sobs. "You're alive," he kept saying. "My son is alive." His mother appeared in the doorway. She fainted. Over the next weeks, Hiroshi learned that reintegration wouldn't be easy. Some neighbors refused to speak to him. The family of a girl he'd courted before the war crossed the street to avoid him. Being a prisoner of war carried a stigma that would last years. But his family accepted him. His mother fed him. Though food was scarce, she somehow found extra rice, vegetables, occasionally a bit of fish. His father never asked about his captivity, never asked what had happened on Saipan. One evening in December 1945, as they sat around the hibachi trying to keep warm, Hiroshi's younger brother Takeshi, who'd been too young to be conscripted, asked what America was like. "It's—" Hiroshi paused, searching for words. "It's impossible to describe. They have so much of everything. Food, water, electricity. They have bottles of cold, sweet, carbonated drinks and they give them to prisoners." "Prisoners?" Takeshi looked confused. "They treated you well?" "Yes." Hiroshi met his father's eyes. "They treated us better than our own army treated us." The room fell silent. "Is that treason to say?" Hiroshi asked quietly. His father shook his head slowly. "No, my son. That's truth." Hiroshi never spoke publicly about his time as a POW. In 1948, he married a woman named Yoko from a neighboring village, a widow whose husband had died in the Philippines. They had 3 children. Hiroshi worked as a fisherman, like his father, and later as a construction worker during Japan's rebuilding boom. He never ate another hamburger, never drank Coca-Cola. Not because they weren't available. By the 1950s, American products flooded Japan, but because every time he saw them, he thought of November 8, 1944, of sitting in that mess hall at Camp McCoy, of crying over food while his countrymen were dying in caves on Iwo Jima and Okinawa. In 1968, a Japanese historian named Takahashi Kenji, no relation to his dead friend Kenji Yamamoto, was researching the treatment of Japanese POWs in American camps. He traveled to Hiroshima Prefecture, interviewing former prisoners. Someone gave him Hiroshi's name. Hiroshi, now 47 years old, agreed to an interview. For 2 hours he told his story, about Saipan, about capture, about Camp McCoy, about the hamburgers and Coca-Cola. "Why did you cry?" Takahashi asked. "Was it the hunger, the relief?" Hiroshi thought for a long moment. "It was the realization," he finally said. "We'd been taught that Americans were devils. That capture meant torture and death. But they gave us hamburgers and Coca-Cola. They treated us like humans. And I realized that everything we'd been told, everything we'd believed was a lie. We died for a lie. Kenji died for a lie. All 30 Orosan men on Saipan died for a lie." Takahashi published his research in 1970 in a book titled Prisoners of Abundance, Japanese POWs in American Camps. It received little attention in Japan. The subject was still too painful, too shameful. Hiroshi Tanaka died on March 15, 1989, at age 68. His obituary in the local paper mentioned his service in the war, his decades as a fisherman, his 3 children and 7 grandchildren. It didn't mention that he'd been a prisoner of war. His family kept that quiet even in death. But before he died, Hiroshi had one conversation with his oldest grandson, Takeshi, named after his uncle who'd asked about America that night in 1945. Young Takeshi was 12, studying World War II in school. "Grandfather, you were in the war, right? Did you fight?" "Yes, I fought." "Did you kill any Americans?" "I don't know. Maybe. It was dark and there was so much shooting, I hope I didn't." "Why would you hope that?" Hiroshi looked at his grandson for a long moment. "Because after the war I learned they weren't the enemy. Not really. We were just young men told to fight each other. They had mothers and fathers and dreams, just like us. They wanted to go home, just like us. And when I was their prisoner, they treated me with more kindness than I'd experienced in my own army." "That doesn't make sense. Why would they be kind to enemies?" "That," Hiroshi said quietly, "is what I spent 40 years trying to understand. I think it's because they were strong enough to be kind. They could afford mercy, because they knew they'd already won." After Hiroshi's death, his widow Yoko found a small box hidden in his workshop. Inside were several items: the jade good luck charm from his grandfather, Kenji Yamamoto's dog tags, a faded photograph of 2 young men in Imperial Army uniforms, and a single empty Coca-Cola bottle. The bottle was from November 8, 1944. Hiroshi had kept it for 45 years. Today, there's a small memorial at Camp McCoy, now Fort McCoy, dedicated to the Japanese prisoners held there during World War II. A brass plaque lists the names of those who were imprisoned and later returned to Japan. Among the 523 names is Hiroshi Tanaka, Private First Class, 43rd Infantry Division, Imperial Japanese Army. No one visits it. Few people know it exists. The story of Japanese POWs crying over hamburgers and Coca-Cola has been largely forgotten. Uncomfortable for Japan because it highlights the dishonor of capture. Uncomfortable for America because it raises questions about why such treatment wasn't extended to all prisoners, particularly in the Pacific Theater. But for one afternoon in November 1944, in a mess hall in Wisconsin, 20 young Japanese men learned that their enemies could show them more humanity than their own government ever had. They learned it through the simple gift of a hamburger and a Coca-Cola. If this story moved you, if you think about the young men on all sides who were told to hate each other but learned they were more alike than different, please hit that like button. Subscribe so these forgotten stories reach more people. And comment below with where you're watching from and whether this story changed how you think about war, about enemies, about the small acts of kindness that can shatter propaganda. Thank you for keeping their memory alive.